moving to my role as chair of the panel, I'm going to raise one basic question, which is, what is the one thing you would like to see happen in Scotland in order for us to deliver more effectively on this agenda we've been talking about today? And I'll move over and get other people to answer that question now. Okay, well, I suggest we just start this end with that question.
Well, it's perfectly obvious to me that the key resource and the key asset of Scotland are the intelligent people in it and their creativity. And we need to equip them to be agile and well-informed in the use of data. And so I believe every stage of education from the age of 4 to 60, if not beyond, should be taking much more concern about the issues of data. Data is the most challenging thing we do. It is trying to represent the world around us in a way in which we can then better understand it, manage it, work with it, react to it, and be part of it. And unless we have better skills in data literacy, in mathematics, in statistics, in managing and handling the data, then we will not be at the forefront, and we will not survive in this turbulent digital revolution. So I'm absolutely convinced that we need major investment at all levels of education, and I think there should be a big push in the schools, a very large push in the colleges and universities, but we should also see ourselves, just like Finland and Singapore and places like that did in the early days of digital communications, as helping the population who want to learn about it to get started. So they had clubs or other social things where people had a chance to learn who were just members of society. And of course you have lots of training in industry, in government, and so on. It's going on already, but it should be much more data-oriented and much more concerned with the issues of how to recognize the value in data, how to recognize the quality of the results from data, how to discuss these things with one another so we become smarter at it.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're going to vote by a level of applause for the proposition. No pressure there.
You say that after they've clapped. That's not fair.
Over to, well, I think the other three are much more worried than you are. Neil.
Okay, thanks. So really, from my perspective, I would like to echo a lot of what Professor Atkinson has said. The skills agenda is absolutely critical. Now, as someone who works in the Scottish marketplace, it's a Scottish business that I work for, it's my day job, you know, getting people with the right skills, you know, enough people with the right skills is fundamentally the main limiting aspect for the growth of our business. But for me, that there's, if it's absolutely one thing we're restricting ourselves to, then for me it's realising that but we've not got the numbers, and we need to increase the numbers of people coming through our universities. But for me, what we've got to look to do is we've got to look to change the nature of the relationship between our academic institutions and our industry partners. And by that I mean that, you know, right now we have fantastic talent in our universities, but we are not monetising that, we are not extracting the value from that in a way that is most effective. Now, I suppose, so how do we do that? It's the obvious question. Well, for myself as the industry lead on our Data Science Innovation Centre bid, it is please fund the Data Science Innovation Centre bid, because that is precisely what we're trying to do with the Data Science Innovation Centre. It is fundamentally change the relationship between industry and academia. It's to provide a place, a thing that people can go to and engage with directly. I have this problem, how can I solve it? I offer these services, who wants them? Now, by looking to do something of that nature, I think we've got the opportunity to change the nature of the relationship. If we're able to do that, we're able to access, greater financial firepower from our private businesses. If we're able to do that, then hopefully you'll see a lot more funding coming through at the universities, and that will in turn continue to fund the skills agenda. So for me, if it's one thing to kickstart this whole process, it's get an innovation centre built, and let's get started on that.
And booing is also allowed. I mean, the only thing I would add to that is I think that also the public sector as potential user, because we have plenty of big, knotted, nasty problems to take to that sort of innovation centre, I think would be the only thing I would add. Pass on now to Roger, who is Chief Statistician at Scottish Government.
So I think for me, there are a whole range of different things that we could do. What I wanted to say was not about what thing, but the way that we do it. Because I've heard lots about collaboration today, but thinking about what we've got as an advantage for Scotland as a relatively small country. It's the fact that we're agile, the fact that we are able to integrate a whole range of different things more easily. And for me, it's about the things that we do being done in a way that we can create the conditions to keep up with or maintain a world-leading place in the big data arena. So investing in systems in a way that are revolutionary. So, for example, I'm involved in the creation of a data sharing and linkage service that's designed with a collaboration of partners that can bring together big data sets and answer some of those really difficult questions, take us to new places. But it's important that that's set up in a way that's got the R&D behind it that can move with the times, move quickly, because this agenda has only just started. It's in evolution, and that's the important thing for me.
And last.
This panel is not working very well, because what makes a good panel session is where they all disagree with each other very politely, but you can see there's barbs going on, and so what I ought to do is disagree with the others and say, no, actually, fundamentally, but given that I work at Dundee University, given we've set up a master's in data science, given that we believe that this skills thing exists, I have to align myself with my panel members, which is really fundamentally boring, and I apologize for that. One of the things I think we can do, though, is that in universities, it is common for universities to look at funding in terms of how many papers you produce. That is a large measure of how universities are funded. Universities are not necessarily rewarded for good teaching and innovative teaching. And I'll put a plug in for Dundee because they do support it even against that. Hence, we set up a master's in BI and a master's in data science, and we're leading the world in that. And I'm enormously grateful. So this is not a dig at my university, which would be tactful or tactless in the extreme anyway. But I think universities can do this, and universities are doing it. And the idea that we should be teaching this not just at university level, but right the way back down, I really and truly could not agree more. I'm sorry. That was very boring. I apologize.
I think that's an honourable draw. I must say, I thought you were going to disagree with yourself at one point there, just to introduce a little bit of dispute. I think, from my perspective, I think the one I would add and sort of emphasise is around the leadership, ensuring that the leadership of our organisations understand enough about the opportunities and what this could do for their services or businesses in order to give priority to creating the conditions for effective collaborative working, which I think links quite closely to a number of the points already made. But this is your opportunity now to either ask questions of the panel or to add your view on what might be added as a priority for what we should do now in Scotland to take this forward. And could you say who you are?
Jens Rasmussen, Marine Scotland. Should we just change and make all government data open by default? Okay, we need to challenge it and privatize and anonymize, but rather than looking at going down a route of finding a way to publish it later on, should it just be that you start out with you publish it unless you have a reason not to?
Your comment on that, Roger, as Chief Statistician?
Well, that's certainly a laudable aim to do that. I think we're starting a data innovation program in Scotland to explore and overcome the difficulties that we have in terms of the skills that were mentioned there, in terms of the IT technology, and that's kind of the future, isn't it? I think that we realistically need to prioritize the data sets that people have told me today and in other locations that are important to them, first of all, and to overcome some of these barriers and then move towards something like that.
Good afternoon, Alex Stobart from Midex Community Interest Company. I would ask the panel what role they envisage for the citizen, whether that be the student looking for a course or a future, or the entrepreneur who may be wishing to break into this field, and how we might use the research to enable the Scottish economy to grow.
I'll take the one at the back there to give everyone a chance to think about that question, and then we'll take the two together.
Duncan McNiven used to be the Registrar General until a couple of years ago. I agree entirely with what's been said about anonymised data and the potential for and strength of linking databases in an anonymised fashion, essentially replicating what the census does, equally anonymised. But there was a powerful presentation that I went to in the morning by David Sibbald about what can be done to share data and use big data to improve the outcome of cancer treatment. And that can't be done anonymously because you need the patient, you need to know at the end of the day who the patient is. And he was asked what difficulty he saw. And the difficulty that he mentioned first was governance. In other words, getting permission, fighting one's way through the Caldecott rules to allow the sharing and use of data for purposes for which it wasn't originally collected. Now, we now have as government chief scientist south of the border, Mark Walport, who in his earlier incarnation co-authored a publication on data sharing which had powerful recommendations along the same lines. So I would say stiffen the resolve based on what John Swinney said this morning about the public acceptance of data sharing for health purposes, stiffen the resolve to allow the sharing and use of data not anonymised, as well as the very important use of linked and anonymised data.
Okay, thanks very much. The issue of what's the role of the citizen? I suppose my starting point would be the citizen owns their own data, but they don't necessarily recognise that, and not all others who use that data recognise that. And so I think one of the big challenges is actually, I think as has been talked about today, to get the dialogue that gets us to the place where it is generally recognised who owns the data. But would you like to comment on that?
Well, if we take it for granted that we're steadily going to improve our data literacy, then one of the things the citizen should be doing is criticising the data and criticising the derivatives of the data. So I think it's strongly to be encouraged to support groups that access data which is made public so they can reanalyse it and challenge the initial interpretations. I think this is particularly important in our long-term planning and our long-term environmental activities and things like that, where it's very challenging to come to unbiased conclusions without other people testing your views. So I think citizens doing that will, of course, develop skills which will lead to their better ability to work in the context of the companies. And so I think it's to the advantage of the companies and the government to do that sort of thing, make data open. I also think that the citizen has shown enormous enthusiasm for contributing information via their mobile apps and their mobile phones and so on. And if we ask them to observe things, they will do it. I was delighted to see that the Glasgow Digital City includes citizen scientists. And I think we should draw on the strengths. And again, that will engage people. Because this is the critical part. We do not want a them and us world, a high priesthood that understands data and how to interpret it, and the rest. We want everybody engaged.
Any other comments on that, Neil?
Yeah, for me, I'd like to link both questions. It's kind of interesting that both questions appeared one after one another, because I think one feeds the answer to the other. And really to follow up what Professor Atkinson has said, that the role for the citizen in this is to take personal responsibility for their data and to raise their own awareness about their data and how it's used. And that starts to answer the second question about allowing data that has been captured and stored to be used for purposes that perhaps weren't originally envisaged. Now, there's a role for government here to make sure that, that there's, that's done sensibly and maturely. But fundamentally, it's about the citizen becoming more aware of data and what that really means. This morning, I heard an interesting sort of soundbite around about this is the first generation that from birth to death, that they will have an indelible digital signature across their whole lifetime. Now that means that for the citizen, that they need to understand that and realise it and take responsibility for it. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see that in pockets. But we've also got a young population especially that seems blissfully ignorant to some of that. At least going by some of the interviews that I do and check out their Facebook pages, they seem blissfully ignorant of it. So for me, it's about citizens becoming more aware and more responsible. And I think that starts to answer the second question about personal responsibility, then allows people to use data in a non-anonymised fashion, and then that starts to give us some real insights, because I think anonymised data is fine so far as it goes, but data that actually contains identity, who is that person? That is one of the key things that allows us to join the additional pieces of the puzzles to gain some real insight about our population. And then, as we've already said, within Scotland, we've got this great thing, NHS 24. The health of a nation flows through that. If we can connect that with identity, then we could really make a major shift.
Yeah, I mean, my view is, not to sound slightly controversial across the panel, but for me, there's already loads of data out there in the public domain. I mean, certainly in Scotland, where we have much more data out there than the other parts of the UK, and to think that citizens now will, if we publish data in an open data format, will kind of take that data and run with it and challenge people. I mean, that may happen at some point in the future, but it was not really, in my view, it's going to happen without that value-added interpretation, the visualization, people able to actually understand, well, what does this data really mean? And I think that's where me and colleagues within Scottish Government, within academia, within business can actually really help people understand and make use of that data. And the question from Duncan there about governance, yeah, absolutely. We need to have, particularly in the public sector, people being able to trust what's happening to their data. It's absolutely fundamental. And in the work that I'm doing around bringing together non-anonymized data, it's fundamental where you can, at the moment, respond to a consultation that's out in the NHS about developing governance arrangements, the National Privacy Advisory Committee that we're working towards making, could that work across not just health, but across all sectors? And actually, what are we doing to engage citizens in the kind of agenda that Neil has been talking about, where we're actually taking that forward as an important part of the work around data?
So I agree with everybody again. So I'll tell you a different answer, and it's simply an answer to this one. How does the citizen engage with this? There is an interesting story, and I don't know the full story. I've been travelling most of the day or teaching. But it looks like the Boston, I don't know if you've been following the story about the Boston bombing. Okay, they ploughed through a huge amount of big data, looking at videos. They got images out, they gave them out to the public. From what I'm hearing, and I don't know, I haven't kept up with this, they have now identified the guys, caught them, and caught one of them. That's citizens dealing with big data. I'll tell you what, we don't know what it's going to be like in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, because you simply could not have done that 10, 15 years ago. I gather they were using like image recognition, face scanning. That's all handling big data. You can't do that as tabular data. That's all big data. Without the citizens, that would not have worked. And it looks like social networks were involved and Facebook. That's how citizens are going to be involved. How exactly, none of us know, but it's going to be an exciting world.
Mm-hmm. And there is no doubt that I think one of the sort of nightmares for the public sector is having to design and deliver services for the full range of the population who've got different requirements in terms of what information they're willing to share and what information they're not willing to share. So the idea of showing resolve in this area may turn out to be important. Anyway, just to try and get a bit of controversy into this, I'm going to let Mark come in with a question at the front.
More of an observation than anything else. That I sometimes think that governments do not act because they're concerned about how the media are going to represent it. And it's reasonably straightforward in this case that, you know, if you decide you're going to have full and open access to the data, then a proportion of the media are going to be banging up and down saying this is disgraceful, this is, you know, this is an affront to my human rights and liberties and everything else. However, if you decide not to do it, then they're going to come back and say 3,000 people died of cancer, quite unnecessarily last year, because you didn't actually release that information and blah, blah, blah. So surely it is the position of government, and I'm putting this as a question to the panel, to actually grow up here and think, okay, we're going to go for what we perceive to be the common good. We're going to take an action. We know it's going to be unpopular in certain areas, but we're actually going to do this. What do the panel feel about that?
Can we start at this end? Because all the time I'm agreeing with everybody else. I just want everybody to know I do have opinions of my own. Pass. No, I don't think. What you can do with big data and analytics is unbelievably powerful. You have to protect the rights of the individuals, I agree with that. But you can't do that by saying we are not going to do anything with this data. As far as I'm concerned, it's enormously powerful. We have got to use it. It can be used for good, it can be used for evil. That is true of virtually any invention you ever come across. Not using it is cowardice. You have to take a more risky line than saying we will just be safe and we won't release this. You do have to guard against abuse. But you've got to be brave with it, because you will save people's lives. You will improve people's lives. I have no doubt we've got to use it.
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree. It's a proportionate governance model for me that there will be risky situations, and it needs a robust process behind that to ensure that the trade-offs there and ensure that it is for the public good. But I absolutely agree that without data, there are going to be people that are dying. There are going to be people that are living in poverty where they wouldn't be otherwise. Without this data, we can't understand, as researchers, what the ways of improving society, and then that we can't support policy makers and ministers in doing that. So, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I was going to disagree or not. I keep coming back to the personal responsibility thing. I think the government does have a role to say, right, get on with it, and sort of take a step back a little bit here and allow data to be more open and suppose be more supporting. But the thing that strikes me as really interesting in this space is that what we're starting to see with the generation that has grown up sharing data and being aware of what that means is that they are incredibly sensitive to perceived changes in how that data is used. So if you look at recently, Facebook purchased Instagram, and then there was a slight changing in the wording of the legal documents, which earlier on, again, one of the speakers mentioned that who actually reads the, every time iTunes comes out with a new version, we just hit accept automatically. Well, that's what Instagram thought when it came to actually sharing data and who owned the data. And very quickly they found that wasn't the case and essentially wiped out half their business overnight. So I think that for me, the place of government in all this is to say, yep, okay, this is coming. This is a tsunami. We cannot stand in front of it, but it's to help equip the citizen so that they are able to understand and take personal responsibility. So it's not just about standing back and saying it will happen, but it's also providing our people, our citizens, with the skills and the awareness to understand this is good, this is bad. Now, for some of our population, some of our citizens, they've already got that. They grew up in this world, but some of them don't, and that's where the government's got to work to help.
In the last decade, I was the UK Science Envoy and twice visited China on envoy business about sharing data and sharing technology and ideas. And I had repeated conversations with Chinese academicians who could not understand why we were so unethical as to put the concerns of an individual ahead of finding the cures to diseases by combining the data. And I can certainly see an example which I showed this morning where now we have 2,300 patients in a cohort study that have given permission. One is beginning to see very clear properties of the differences, genetic differences in breast cancers. When you consider that in 2001, the goal of one of the projects was to combine breast cancer data from multiple sites across the country, and it completely failed because people wouldn't share it. We'd have got to that cohort number in 2001. So 10 years is, I see it as, yes, the Chinese academicians were asking me a very hard question. How could I be so unethical as to not share the medical data?
I think, that comment rather highlights the profound nature of the issue. This is in part an issue about completely different cultural frameworks and sets of standards. In some respects, I think the Facebook example does tell you that being brave is important, but being foolhardy is going to get you into a worse situation and you'll make less progress. For me, you've got the data which for which there are no real issues from a personal privacy perspective, and we need to get on with making that open. Second, I think for more personal data, we need to be able to demonstrate the case for making it open. In other words, it's because people will die, it's because we'll be able to fundamentally improve services. And third, I think we should try to stop reinventing the wheel, because in a lot of areas of data sharing, personal data sharing, the Information Commissioner has produced advice, people have found ways of achieving the outcomes and sharing the data in a sensible way, but then somewhere else in Scotland, the same issue is being seen as a barrier. And that, actually getting a common, consistent view of how to achieve the level of data sharing you need, I think is something which I think we need to do better on. I saw one further at the front, and first you and then you.
Roland Chaplin, I'm an applied meteorologist, but I've a keen interest in the process of government. And Neil, I just wanted specifically to come back to you because I wouldn't want people to misinterpret the implication of what you are saying, because there are other areas where it's hugely important, as I'm sure you know, Mike, for government departments actually to work together much faster, much more effectively, with a much stronger lead from government. So in two of these, the McClelland report and its implementation, and in the use and encouragement of renewable energy with its low carbon footprint in the data industry, because it's so rapidly expanding and the need for energy and the storage and processing of data is so great. The bringing together of these two themes, how should government be more strongly proactive in the best interests of Scotland?
I'll take another couple of questions, I think, because I'm conscious that this is quite a talkative panel, so you may not get another chance.
You mentioned about the division between sharing data where it's required, so like for medical use, but if we take, for example, the backlog of data on the Twitter or Facebook, there's no means to erase your entire database if you wanted to. And so it's these types of scenarios where people will dig the data for dirt, for controversy, or misrepresentation, and it's, I think if you're saying the data belongs to the person, then being able to take ownership of that and being able to remove files if required, that's not a provision that's there. So this is a key area, is the legislation behind being able to really own your data post certain systems where data is shared. And this is a question that's not answerable, but it's a question that is very, very imminent into everything that we're trying to do in Scotland.
I'll pick up one further question from Chris over there.
Thanks. So Chris Yu from Policy Exchange. Mike, you were asking earlier, what's the one thing that would make a difference? And I'm on board with this idea that we've got to do better on education and capability, but that takes time. And I would suggest, if you want to move the leadership, then one of the things to do here is give them some really powerful examples of how this works. And a few years ago, behavioural economics and the Thaler and Stunstein book on nudge was all the rage, but we weren't sure how to get government departments to move on this. And what the Prime Minister did was he put together a nudge unit at the central government. It's 10, 12 people, combination of civil servants, academics, secondees, with a mandate to work with departments, find examples of really big savings, and do that really, really quickly. So it leaves me wondering whether we need something similar for data analytics. How about a data analytics team with the mandate to march into departments, find the savings, and prove this can be done?
It has an awful lot of attractions and actually links to the Innovation Centre. The beauty of collecting three is that we only need to answer the easy ones. But I'll start this end again with any comments on either the three sets of issues. The one that resonated with me, because the first one was really for Neil, around what's the state doing about assuring that people own their own data. I would draw quite a strong distinction between the state's responsibility in respect to the data that the citizen gives to the state, where I think most of the discussion today was focused around that. I think the second question is whether we ultimately get to a more regulated market for information held by others. I think is the one to which at the moment I don't have an answer, but which it will become so central to our lives that we can have a conference on that next year.
So I think that erasing data is a very interesting question, because actually it challenges our current technical ability as because of the physics of the way data is stored. It leaves imprints even if you write over it many times. And so the US security organizations believe the only way of obscuring the data is to actually burn the disk. The mechanisms that you use in every activity and system make copies all the way along the paths from you to the data destination and on the way back. And we know that forensic analysts can use those copies to discover whatever you've been doing. To find a way of deleting information so as it cannot be found with that level of intelligence is technically too expensive at present. And also we do far too little to keep track of the copies that have been made and the provenance of all the data that's been collected in other places. So if it's ever been up on a web page, it's probably stored in lots of other people's places where they've been scraping those web pages to build indexes and so on. So being able to erase your data and remove it, I think we are not smart enough to do that yet.
Neil,
think first before you jump.
Yes, so yeah, that's for sure. So yeah, I wasn't quite sure what the question actually was in terms of misunderstanding what I was saying. So what?
We're giving the impression that government's role was, in effect, to empower the citizen to do as much as possible. Of course, I absolutely concur with that. But I thought the other side of the coin needed also to be mentioned, that there was a role for strong government in Scotland to get all the public bodies to work together to get the efficiencies that are being called for in the McClelland report. And it was to ask for comment on that, really.
So I think, and maybe I will say this because I'm from industry, but I do believe in. So if you take the second question, which is about the ability to delete data, and Professor Atkinson's response about how we're not smart enough yet, and you quite rightly said, well, that's easy to say unless you're 14-year-old and you're not really that clever about what you post and what you don't, or as exposed in the Daily Record this week, if you're an ex-Celtic footballer who proceeds to tweet his friends a certain inappropriate image. But that is the reality of the situation. And so I'm a great believer that we need to educate our citizens for the reality of the situation. The point about government, and especially government in Scotland, because of the size of the country that we are, has an amazing opportunity to push heads together to say, get this information shared, because we're small enough as a country that I think we can actually do that. And I think we are as a country left-wing enough that we can see collectively the benefit in that. And I think that's really powerful. We're quite a socialist-minded country by nature, I believe. And so the greater good, the common good, is something that speaks to a great many Scots. And so having a Scottish government with a population the size it is, I think gives us a great opportunity for that. But it does always, for me, come back to the fundamental thing about the citizen, about the individual, about knowing what information you have, what you store, what you give out, what you pass on. This is an education piece. Now we've got a whole set of young people who have got that, but we need to make sure that becomes embedded, and that goes right back again to skills, to the education system, and again, there's a place in government there. But the point, Carl, the question, or the sort of issue that Chris raised as well, I thought when you were going to go was legislation. One of the big problems we have within Scotland, but also the UK and Europe in general, our lawyers are incredibly slow, right? The laws aren't moving quickly enough, and they get in the way of some of this information sharing, and that's a real problem. The laws don't move fast enough, and that's a big impingement on this.
I think I should have stopped Neil before he made that
Sorry.
last comment, because I thought the combination of we've got to live with the world as it is rather than as we would wish it to be, and that we in Scotland are well placed by virtue of our scale and our collaborative culture to actually exploit this are two really important messages to take out. I'm going to have to bring this to a close because we have overrun a couple of minutes. One of the most frightening things about big data I heard was that quite soon it will be possible, by having sensors on all the audience, to actually know how many people are paying attention at any one time. and the reason I raise that now is that I as well as thanking the panel, I think you should actually say thank you to yourselves, because I felt the energy in the room right until the very end. So say thank you to everybody.